After my adventures with Rocky, I was done with the fast life. I got a job at the diner serving food to customers, and after a couple of weeks, Dennis called on me again and we started going out. He was a real serious man, thoughtful and solid, different from Rocky and the other men I had seen in Harlem who had hung around Small Paradise. Dennis was a violinist who had come to New York from High Point, North Carolina. He came to New York in his middle 20s, which was a late age for most folks to leave home in those days, but he was the only child and his mother Etta didn't want him to leave home. She had a few miscarriages and Dennis was her only son, but he went to New York because he wanted to pursue music. He played violin and read music and composed it, mostly classical and religious music. Your father came from the same town and went to the high school as John Coltrane, but he was ahead of Coltrane in age. Dennis used to sit around with stacks of sheet music when I first met him, scribbling at it and scoring it out. He played the violin beautifully, and I often asked him to play various songs for me, and he also was a good singer and sang in the Metropolitan Baptist Church choir in Harlem. Dennis almost starved to death fooling around with that music, which is why I never wanted you fooling around with it when you decided making a living at it. They wouldn't hire a black man for the orchestras or anything like that in those days, and he scuffled around and slept in flop houses. What saved him were some friends from his hometown in High Point, Curtis and Minnie Ware. Curtis worked as a superintendent in an apartment house in Manhattan, and he and Minnie were well off compared to most black folks who came up from the South, because they lived rent-free. Curtis and Minnie housed and fed whole families and had migrated north from High Point, but Dennis was too proud to look them up. Only after he was starving, sleeping in flop houses, he'd tell them, "I've got no money and no place to go," and they were angry with him. They said, "You should have come to us sooner." They had 4 other friends and a sister from South, all crammed in their apartment. At meal times, there was a huge round table filled with all kinds of Southern cooking, baked goods, and cold drinks. After Dennis got on his feet and got a job at my Aunt Mary's leather factory, we started going out. He brought me by there and said, "I want y'all to meet a friend of mine," and their eyes kind of popped out when I walked into the room. This was around the 1940s, and black and white didn't do what me and Dennis were doing, walking around and such. Some folks did it, but it was all secret. Or they were a good time, partying folks like Rocky's friends at Small Paradise. But Dennis was a Christian man and a serious man. So were his friends. This was no joking matter to them. Well, once they managed to pull their jaws from off the floor, they said, "Our house is your house, sit down and eat." I didn't have any problem with them or with any Dennis's family. They took me in with open hearts and made me one of their own. The only thing was, it was sometimes took a minute for them to get over the shock of seeing a black and white together. Like Aunt Candace, Aunt Candace was Dennis's favorite. She was the grandchild of slaves. When I first came to North Carolina and walked into her house, she said, "I just hoped you excuse me for looking at you so hard, because I never had a white person in my house before, and I've never been this close to a white person before." And I said, "All right," and she was my friend till she died. I'll never forget her as long as I live. She lived to be nearly 100. We wouldn't have made it without Aunt Candace. She came up from North Carolina and cared for y'all after Dennis died, because I was grieving and lost and I couldn't move. She took the train all the way up to New York from North Carolina and took care of all 8 of you, including you, James, and you weren't but a tiny child. She had never been to the city before. She never seen such cement and so many tall buildings in her life. Your stepfather, he bought her a big gold watch after he married me, and she left to go home to North Carolina. He said, "That's some woman." He was right. She was some woman. Well, Dennis was a solid, clean Christian man. He seemed to understand me and seemed right through me. It wasn't long before I fell in love with him, and after a few months, we started thinking of getting married. Well, I was starting to think of getting married. Dennis hemmed and bawed on it, and finally he said, "Let's live together as husband and wife. We don't need that world to know we're married. The world isn't ready for us yet." That excuse was okay for me, for the time being. So we rented a room in the Port Royal on 129th Street. We had a room in a 3-bedroom apartment run by a lady named Miss Ellis. She and her husband had 1 bedroom, and they rented her other 2 out, and we shared the kitchen and bathroom. Just like that, I left home. I left Bud's apartment one day and never came back. See, Bubby was old and she had diabetes and couldn't control me. It wasn't like my aunts were calling to check on me or anything like that. They had their own lives and they didn't care about me. I was a grown child. I wasn't no baby then. They got out there and do your own thing. And there was attitude, so I did my own thing. I moved in with Dennis and I didn't regret it. He continued to work for my aunt while I was living with him, and she never knew it. It was a scandal, don't you think? But I did miss my mother. I missed her terribly, and would think of her and my sister Dee Dee often. One day I had a feeling, and I just wanted to talk to Mommy. Even though I knew she didn't agree with how I was living, so I got a pile of coins together and I went outside our little room on 129th Street to a payphone and called Suffolk. Since Dennis and I lived in the room in somebody's apartment to use the phone, you had to sit in the woman's living room. I couldn't call my mother and talk Yiddish on the lady's phone. It seemed too odd to do. I was too embarrassed, so I went outside. It was a big deal to call long distance in those days. When I called, Tate picked up the line and he told me, "I don't know what you're doing up there, but your mother's sick and I need help with the store." So I came back to Suffolk. I didn't want to, but since Mommy was sick, I needed to go back. I told Dennis I was going home for a few weeks, and he said he would write and send me money, which he did. When I got to Virginia, I told Tate, "I'll help out for a while, but I'm not staying." He ignored that. One of the first things he did was take me out to Portsmouth to one of his Jewish merchant friends, supposedly to do business, and introduced me to this man's son. He was pressing me to marry this fat guy who I didn't even know, but I had no plans on that. I come home for Mommy. She was getting more ill. She had become nearly blind in her left eye and would black out. She wasn't a total cripple. Not even when she was ill was she truly crippled. She cooked all day and also darn socks. She could chop fish, meat, vegetables on a butcher block cutting board, all with one hand. She was a good Jewish wife who kept true to her religious faith, and she let a lot roll off her back over the years because her husband wasn't worth a dime and she had no choice. The way Tate treated her, they called her an abused woman today. Back then, they just called you wife, and man could do anything he wanted to his wife in the South, especially if she's a Jew who's crippled and he's a so-called rabbi. He can yell at her, make fun of her, curse her, slap her, and he could even go out with another woman right in front of her face. She tried to ignore that, too, as long as she could, and I don't think she knew for a whole while, because Tate was always a little strange anyway. You know, a secretive. He never told us anything like where he was born or if he had any family or relatives. Every summer he will disappear for a few weeks to Europe. He will say, "I'm going to see my landsman," and off he go on a steamer to France someplace. Landsman in Jewish is somebody from your hometown, we run to the store in his absence, me and Didi and Mame. To this day, I don't know exactly where he went, but a few weeks later, he'd strut into the store, put down his bags, and say, "Where's my money?" "Where? Give it to him." And he would sit down and count it. Even before he took off his jacket, he'd count his money. He knew just how much he was supposed to earn a week. More or less, he was serious about his money. This big fat white lady started showing up at the store around 1939 or 1940. She had a behind as big as the living room. She lived not far from us up the road. Her husband was serving time in the county jail across the street for being drunk or some petty crime like that. She wasn't Jewish, and she had 4 or 5 kids. Tate would talk to her in the store and try to act like it was casual. Then on Friday nights, the Sabbath, Mr. Rabbi would go out. Me, Didi, and Mame would light the candles and say one prayer to begin the Sabbath, and Tate would pack a bag of groceries and throw them in the car while Mame watched him. He would say her in Yiddish, "I'm going out." Then he would say to me in English, "I won't be back till Monday. Open up the store Sunday morning." Then Mame would ask me, "What did he say?" "Nothing else say." This marriage was falling apart, and I was in the middle. I'll translate between them. Tate's affair between full-blown very quickly. The way I remember it, before I knew it, he moved her and her kids across the North Carolina line someplace, about an hour drive from Suffolk, and he once even dragged me down there and made me wait outside the woman's house while he ran inside. He started bothering me to get Mame to give him a divorce, trying to talk to her through me. She refused, and I could understand her dilemma. She was in her early 40s. Then and there was nobody to look out for her. She was handicapped, she was sick, she had no other home. She was not giving him a divorce, never. I don't think she had one friend down in Suffolk at that time either, not that I remember, except for her mother. She had nobody to turn to, because her sisters never cared for her that much. She was just a crippled thing to them, and they rarely wrote to her, and never gave her any credit for the good things she had done. Their way of being kind to her was to take me in during the summers, and by then, they were done with me, because I wasn't a child anymore. And when Tate wanted to divorce her so he could marry his fat girlfriend, this woman who was bigger and taller than him, and who wasn't even Jewish, a goy, it was so disgusting. I could barely stand it. In order for my parents to get a divorce properly in the Jewish faith, they would have had to go to a Rav, a kind of high Jewish rabbi, but Tate didn't care for no Rav. He was done with being religious. He went out to a lawyer one day and came back with some papers and laid them on the table and told me, "Tell your mother to sign these." They were divorce papers. Mama refused. Then he went to Reno, Nevada, and got himself a quickie divorce. He came back to Virginia and said, "Tell your mother we're divorced." And that was it. But nothing changed in my house. We all still lived together, and we were all miserable. By this time, I was home a few weeks, a lot longer than I had planned, and I wanted to leave. It was a miserable time, especially for my poor sister Didi. Didi was 4 years younger than me, only about 15 then. What a life she had. Of all of us as children, Didi had the worst of it because she was the youngest. Didi didn't seem to have problems. I always thought she was prettier than me. She wasn't rebellious like I was. We were like night and day. She was short and had curly brown hair, while I was tall and dark and thin and had a mustache. When she was little, she refused to wear hand-me-downs and wore nice skirts and socks and always looked neat, whereas I would wear hand-me-downs and looked like a sack of potatoes no matter what I wore. Didi was very important. She got good grades in school, while me and my brother Sam barely passed. She was Tate's favorite, and I was always a little jealous of her because Tate paid for her piano lessons while he wouldn't allow me to take them and that sort of thing. See, She was the first American in my family. While Sam and I were immigrants, and we kind of had that immigrant thing on us. The kids would make fun of us for being Jewish in school, but they wouldn't make fun of Dee Dee. You just didn't do that to Dee Dee. She had confidence. She was a nice Jewish girl who did what she was told. I mean, she was in high school going through the things high school girls go through, playing tennis and learning piano, and when Tati was divorcing Mommy, she got lost in all that. No one ever talked to her or shared feelings with her, including me. We were close, not close enough for me to tell her the mess I had made of my life, but close enough. And one evening, she came up to our bedroom and said, "I know you're going to leave, Rachel. Don't leave. Don't go back to New York." Dee Dee was so proud for her to ask me to stay. Well, she meant it. We didn't talk to each other that way, and for her to come out and say what she was feeling was hard for her. It hurt me so much to hear it because I couldn't stay. "I'll think about it," I said. "I don't believe you," she said. "I know you're going back. Please don't go back. Promise me you'll stay." She sat on the bed and buried her face in her hands and cried, "My little sister. Promise me," she sobbed. "Promise me you'll stay." "Okay, I promise." I said, "I'll stay." But I broke my promise to Dee Dee, and she never forgot it, and she would remind me of it many years later.